When I was in my first semester at our beloved Brite Divinity School and witnessed one of my peers in this pulpit for the first time, I couldn't help but wonder if I might ever get the opportunity to do that. And I have to confess that when I dreamed about today as a doe-eyed first year, this isn't really what I thought it would be. For starters, I imagined that if I ever got to be in this pulpit, that someone else might show up in the pews today. But as it stands, it's just me and the sound tech. Thankfully, though, as they say, where two or more are gathered. I also didn't imagine us attending most of our classes virtually at an academic institution that prides itself on in-person academic experiences. It turns out that a lot of Divinity School is that way. Unexpected. God tends to be that way too, showing up, breaking through in places that we didn't think to look or perhaps didn't expect to find her lurking. Yes, God has a way of surprising us and disrupting our routines. Mondays are my favorite routine at Brite Divinity School. Because we don't typically have classes, it tends to be more natural community building. It's the day when you vow to get most of your reading done for class, but inevitably end up at Avoca skimming and talking to your friends instead. It's the day that you spend most of your day in staff meeting all across the Metroplex. For some of you, it's the day that you start a brand new full work week, or the day that you send your kids off for a new week of class. April 15th of 2019 was a Monday. I was in my first year, although I was nearing the end of it, so I wasn't quite as doe-eyed anymore. You might not recall what April 15th means, but for those of us in non-Orthodox traditions, we might recall that it was the Monday of Holy Week. At about 10:30 a.m. that morning, you likely got some sort of push notification on a device or from a news outlet letting you know that the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris had caught fire. I don't know what the rest of your day looked like, but I grabbed my coziest blanket, pulled my lukewarm cup of tea close to my chest, buried myself deep into the pillows of my very worn, very loved hand-me-down couch, laid aside the reading I vowed I would do for the day, and resigned myself to flipping back and forth between news stations for the remainder of the afternoon. Flames that started out looking somewhat contained in that 12th century cathedral rapidly overtook the heart of Paris. I remember watching the news anchors repeating different forms of the statement, "We cannot overstate how iconic this cathedral is in the heart of Paris." They couldn't overstate the importance of it, yet none of them could ever really state what its importance was either. For hours that day, people gathered around screens, mourning as a community, able to do nothing more than bear witness as roaring flames and billowing smoke filled its way all the way into the attic and spire. The spire that for more than 800 years stood prominently in the skyline of Paris. Yet by midday on Monday of Holy Week, that spire made of 13th century lumber toppled over. And I sank further into my couch as I saw the spire begin to lean. recalling that this might be its final moments standing in history. I inhaled a big breath of grief. And then, as the spire fell, I unexpectedly exhaled a sigh of relief. When the spire fell, it hit me that for what was eerily encroaching 1,000 years of history, on Holy Week, millions of people have seen God in a particular way. In a way that the burning of the Notre Dame Cathedral let them grieve, because it was the physical manifestation of that church and of that God. And when that spire fell, it hit me that maybe, just maybe, there was hope that something could change. Maybe we weren't going to be tied to that way of doing church anymore. I hoped even that somewhere on the other side of a screen, somewhere in the globe, there were pastors who also felt that unexpected, renewed sense of wonder, who were shocked at how exciting this Holy Week was shaping up to be after all. It turns out that even Holy Week in seminary isn't what you expect it to be. That day and that week, as Good Friday and Easter approached, I was sure it was bound to be the craziest Holy Week I would ever experience in Divinity School. We didn't know it yet, but 2020 was going to get a good chuckle out of that notion. Because Holy Week of 2020 wasn't what we saw coming either. The burning of the cathedral, the pandemic Easter morning of 2020, and the exiled people following Ezekiel, they all have something in common. We recognize the sudden jarring in our bones, a shared communal feeling of recognizing that what you have always known to be true about the world no longer is. The exiles who followed Ezekiel were well past their point of weary. While they had bodies that moved and hearts that beat, they were a people completely overwhelmed with devastation. They had experienced the unparalleled leveling of the Jerusalem temple, their most holy of holies. The destruction of the temple killed many of its inhabitants and forced the survivors to migrate. They followed Ezekiel while the Babylonians tortured the inhabitants of Jerusalem with siege warfare for nearly 2 years. Famine and disease abounded. They were bone-tired and hungry for something more than what they were currently experiencing. For these exiles, the hopelessness and despair were not just emotional states, they were shared communal experiences of trauma. And it's not just the exiles who were weary either, but their prophetic leader Ezekiel too. Once a rising star, a prophet with a bright and promising future, he was the next big visionary, the one everyone expected to transform the communities he touched. He was the next big thing. But in the wake of temple destruction and an oppressed community merely trying to survive, the once bright and doe-eyed prophet was now a bit ragged and frayed around the edges. He himself was now a refugee who was also desperately seeking glimmers of hope on a desert floor to give people feeling hopeless themselves. The rocky bottom of the desert floor is looking pretty bleak for the prophet and his exiles. Hopeless in a desert full of bones so dry that even the marrow has dried up. That is to say, there was no hope of normal life left among those present. Everything has changed for them. Here, in a desert of dry bones, there was no hope left for a normal life. For those on the valley floor, there isn't much reason to keep pressing forward. Sure, the past behind them is pretty less than desirable, but this is a horizon filled and lined with death everywhere they look. These people are desperate for the hope they once knew and felt and experienced. The hope that heals them. They are so desperate for hope that they can pull that familiar feeling off of a shelf, twirl it around in their hand, look at it and wonder, is it even worth blowing the dust off of it? Will these bones ever live again? They had to wonder, will it ever go back to normal? The crux of this biblical narrative is displacement. Displacement of a people longing to return home. And displacement isn't an unfamiliar biblical narrative. Our scriptures are filled with stories of displaced people, of being thrown out of Eden, of being outsiders in the land of Egypt, the journey to the promised land, and yes, right here on the desert floor. Displaced people across generational lines long for a sense of normalcy, the comfort of knowing and being known. Often we long for that even when it has been abusive or oppressive in our past, when it has kept us marginalized for so long that it has become part of our identity. We hope for the idyllic normal that probably never even existed. Ezekiel's refugees know this feeling too, asking, when is normal happening again? Don't we all kind of feel that way too? Look, I know that wearing a mask everywhere I go is what Jesus would do. I know it's the modern way to love thy neighbor, but that doesn't mean that I don't miss the days when I could just grab my keys and be out the door. Or heck, I just miss the days when I could go out the door. I miss the days when instead of having my car chapstick and my bedside chapstick and my end table chapstick was a thing, instead now I have my car mask and my backup mask and my backpack mask. I miss seeing peers on the way to class, like the ones that I wouldn't see anywhere else except class or community hour, chapel. And I miss church. I miss preaching with people actually in the pews. I miss singing loud and proud off-key to hymns that are not my own. I miss communion, and I know so many of you who have cried out how much you miss your Eucharist traditions. I'm an introvert, and in some small way, I miss passing the peace. And God bless those of you who are huggers right now, because I don't know what you're doing to cope. So yes, who knew that when is normal happening again is an ancient biblical question too. Turns out that the answer is pretty similar as well. When is normal happening again? It's not. Normal cannot be put back together after what we've experienced. That world, while there are shreds of it left, cannot be put back together again. As commanded, the dry bones reconnected. They rejoined, tendons and muscles and skin covered them. But those bones moved about stiffly at best. They weren't really alive again. There was no breath of life in them. All of the right parts were there, but the spirit was not yet in them. You see, the bones couldn't just be put back together. They had to be recreated differently to learn to move again. God did not simply try to resurrect the structure the bones had once been, because God does that. God resurrects, but this is God recreating. It took the breath of the Holy One to recreate something new, to put life where it wasn't before. The academic year ahead of us is not likely to be what we expected it to be. It will not be Brite Divinity School, but Zoom edition. It will not be last year, the same parts just resurrected. The bones can't just be put back together, because that only results in a lifeless structure. It takes the breath of the Holy One to create something new, to put life where it wasn't before. If we live in the church world of yesterday, it is no wonder that bodies can't move. They're breathing air that is polluted by centuries' worth of dust and ashes. We may long for that comfortable normal, but it is gone. The bones, the parts, they may still exist, but the life source within them no longer makes them dance. To move and dance again with the freedom and the vision of the Spirit, we must breathe in the Spirit's air of today. We have to remain open to the invitations God is revealing, so that we can capture some of God's new vision for a better normal, to share possibilities with those whom we lead and serve. What a time to be divinity students, faculty, staff. Our careers and callings will be shaped by how our bones learn to dance again with the Spirit that animates us all. What an exhilarating time to be discerning God's breath moving among us. We are not tied to the church of yesterday or even the church of a few years ago. We went from waiting 18 months for boards and elders and dioceses to make decisions or votes to trying something new overnight. We too are searching for God in unfamiliar places. Because that's what you do when you're displaced. Displaced people are forced to seek the holy in places they have never looked before. And when we go looking for God in places we never expected to find them, we may find life breathed into bones and ashes. The exiles and their exhausted, washed-up prophets all shared in communal trauma, in grieving the loss of their Holy of Holies, and are forced to examine their most tightly gripped assumption about the temple that would forever be the dwelling place of the Holy One and the place they would worship God together. Notre Dame wasn't even a full collapse of a place where people worship God together. A place where people were convinced they would always be able to encounter God. And Zoom isn't the last and final house of worship either. And thanks be to God for that. Hope is in new life. New breath, not just in resurrection of the old, but in recreation for a better normal. We may find hope on the bottom of desert floors, in the collapse of fiery spires, and in the newness unfolding before us. The Spirit adds life to the new creation of church, whatever it needs to look like for today. So keep your eyes peeled on the bottom of this desert floor, because, beloveds, when we serve a God who shows up in unexpected places, we never know what they might breathe the breath of life into next. May it be so. May it be so for us all. Amen.